Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are. My understanding is about 300 people joining us today from different corners of the world. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker today for the inaugural lecture, Esther MacCallum-Stewart. Esther has been working at Staffordshire University for 5 years in the Games and Visual Effects Department, where she teaches game studies and design. This includes modules on board gaming, game studies theory, and world building, which uses tabletop role-playing games in order to help students create narrative world in games. Esther's PhD thesis examined popular representations of the First World War, which included a section on role-playing and video games. Despite being told to underplay this aspect, as it was not considered academic enough, Esther ignored this and decided to focus her work on how representation in games contributes to cultural awareness and themes like identity, sexuality, and gender. Esther is a bid chair for 2024 World Science Fiction Convention, Worldcon, which will take place in Glasgow. Worldcon is the longest running event of its kind, bringing together science fiction and fantasy writers and creatives from around the world. She has been playing tabletop role-playing games since her teens, and has written about them throughout her academic career. She's currently writing about the cultural changes in Dungeons and Dragons and how it has affected the gaming landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the talk by Professor Esther MacCallum-Stewart.
Hi, hello everybody. So yeah, thank you, El-Haj. I was told not to look at him because he's disappeared off now. But thank you for that. And for those of you who also want to follow along with our live tweet, then please use the hashtag #GIN2024. GIN2024. So hi, hello everybody, and welcome, and thank you for tuning in, and thank you for those of you who sort of said hi on YouTube, because I was having a look at that, and it was really nice to see you all there. So thanks, fam. I'm really pleased you're here. So I'm a professor now, and it's traditional when you give your inaugural lecture that you talk about your career and all of the illustrious things that you've done and why it's so important, and the sort of great achievements that you've made and the mountains that you've climbed. And I thought, well, how better to do that than by talking about something that has informed my writing, my playing, my involvement with the science fiction community, and my thoughts right through my academic career. So I'm not going to talk about all the different papers and all the different things that I've done, but I'm going to talk instead about a game that has tracked alongside my lifetime. Now, Dungeons & Dragons is 50 in 2024. And as I said, it's something that has been absolutely integral to my development as an academic, to my thoughts as an academic. And I just kind of wanted to sort of say this as I start. Again, I teach and study and research game studies. And what I'm not going to do in this lecture, this is the session 0 for those of you who play, I'm not going to talk about why game studies is a legitimate area of study, because it is. It's that simple. Games is an art form, and it should be treated as such. And I sort of wanted to say this because I get asked all the time. When questions happen, and you'll be able to ask questions at the end, I always get the following. Well, I don't really play games, but. And my heart sinks when I hear that, because I think if another academic gave me a really fascinating paper, I wouldn't begin it by saying, well, I don't know anything about the forensic scientists, the forensic science, the sciences. I can't even say their discipline. And it seems to me that is something that we need to kind of get rid of. So what I want to do instead is celebrate this amazing game and talk through why it is so incredibly important to the landscape of gaming itself. Because Dungeons & Dragons has informed so many other games and methods of play and role-playing that it's kind of become so integral that we often don't realise how important it is. So having said that, this is me. That's me. Oh, goodness me, pointing. Yeah, there we go. That's me. With considerably different hair. Obviously, this is my natural hair now. I was a terrible dye job there. But this is me and my friends, and I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons since 1991, and I've played a variety of different games. You can see a whole load of them at the bottom. Of course, Dungeons & Dragons, Masks of Nyarlathotep, which is a sort of horror Cthulhu game set in the world of H.P. Lovecraft. I have to speak more slowly and then I won't fall over my words. And Castle Falkenstein was another game. We used to play that at Christmas, and we'd have a sort of special silly game where we'd all sort of run around in ridiculous corsets, metaphorically, and shoot blunderbusses at each other. And I always feel I have real sort of feelings when I look at this image, because, you know, this is the group of us. I don't play with this group anymore, unfortunately, because I moved away. I got a job at Staffordshire, and here I am in the games department. But it wasn't just playing these games, it was coming together maybe once a month, getting together in my friend Pete's living room, getting out our dice, getting out innumerable pots of hummus and carrots and sweets and whatever, and sitting down and enjoying playing this game. And during the course of playing, whilst I was playing with this group, we went through a lot of life as well. You know, we went through partnerships, we went through marriages, we went through divorces, we went through illnesses. And a lot of people, when they talk about Dungeons & Dragons or other tabletop role-playing games that they've played, they'll often contextualize this in this way and sort of say, oh, my group have been playing for so long, and, you know, I have all these kind of wonderful memories. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Previously, there's been research that has sort of said, you know, there's this kind of interlinking. And actually, more recently, we've actually seen studies that say, no, players are very, very clear on what is fantasy and what is reality. But it's not necessarily a bad thing that they're playing out experiments or changes or different personalities in the games that they play. So that's kind of, again, one of the things that I want to talk about, because over the last few years, Dungeons & Dragons in particular has seen a massive revival. It has suddenly become big nerd news again. But having said that, nerd culture, and I mean that in an entirely positive way, I'm not using that phrase at all derogatorily, is a really integral and important part of culture now. Certainly teaching it at the University of Staffordshire, we're teaching students whose parents have played role-playing games and video games and have, you know, watched movies or TV series. It's part of our cultural lifestyle now. And throughout that, Dungeons & Dragons has sort of moved as this changing, flexible text, as I say, informing things, changing things, and underpinning the way that we understand this. And actually, it's something that is kind of part of the university syllabus. I'll talk about that in a later slide. So, some background history. So, Dungeons & Dragons first released in 1974 at Gen Con by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. And interestingly, there's been quite a lot of revisionist history about this particular release, because in the past it's been presented as a sort of, you know, it fell from the clay. There'd been a previous game called Chainmail, but this was sort of the sequel, and this was the first time that again, sort of magic had been used in these games, and wasn't it really incredible? And the writing that's come out recently about it has actually looked at it in the wider frame of science fiction conventions, of gaming events, and of miniature war games, which tend to be sort of mentioned as a bit of an aside in previous histories. And what they actually say is that there were a lot of miniature war games being played, and particularly at conventions where people would sort of get together, they'd get out their boards, they'd get out their miniatures, they'd sort of set everything up. But these were in some ways quite limited because they were based on historical events. So when you were playing a historical miniatures game, although of course you could use revisionist history, there would always be an expected end. So you would always know that actually the Battle of X ended in a certain way, or the Napoleonic Wars had the certain factions and historical figures. And what Dungeons and Dragons did was it actually sort of just changed this. It changed this for what if instead of having a cannon, you had a wizard, and the cannon fires a cannonball, right? But what if the wizard fired a fireball? And that's really fascinating because it means you've taken this kind of static object and soldiers who are sort of a bit of a mass, and they've become individuals. And I think, and this is where it's very odd because I'm sort of trying to look at the screen and my slides are sort of next to the camera, so it's about 2 meters away from me. But it's really interesting that Dungeons and Dragons is not described as a tabletop role-playing game when it's first released. It's described as a squints at the screen. Thank you very much for the people who've enlarged it. Thank you. Rules for fantastic medieval wargame campaigns, playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. Thank you. And really fascinating about that is also the one thing that for me is a really important part of Dungeons and Dragons, imagination and storytelling. Neither of them are present. And as Dungeons and Dragons moves through various iterations over the past 48, nearly 50 years, that becomes a real moment because, what are the motivations for that wizard? Like, why are they firing a fireball? How did they become magic? Like, what's their, are they angry? Did they want to be part of this war? They're not just a cannon anymore. They're a sort of living, breathing figure. And I think it's really fascinating that while the early rules were very prosaic, they kind of immediately escape. They immediately escape into the game that perhaps we find a bit more recognizable now, which is very much about iterating your character and going on an adventure. So that, yes, they sort of rush off the page. So I'm going to just step to the side for that. There we go, because I want to show the whole picture. Thank you. So this is kind of what we think about when we think about Dungeons and Dragons. This is kind of the typical image. So we've got a dragon, it's breathing fire, there's some people, one of them is quite short, they're holding a hammer, they're probably a dwarf. There's somebody throwing some sort of magic on the left-hand side, and there's a weird person with a tail on the right-hand side, and it's all very, very dramatic. And there's all of these things kind of going on at the same time, and it's definitely in a dungeon. We've got a real kind of Bridge of Khazad-dûm going on there. I mean, I do not want to be that dwarf when that dragon starts to kind of throw that fireball, because not only are they going to be immediately blasted backwards, but they're just going to die. They need to get out of the way. But there's a lot of, it's very, very high fantasy. And early Dungeons and Dragons was very much thought to, or took a lot of inspiration from Lord of the Rings. Again, the sort of traditional history has it that it was mainly played by university students who were all reading Tolkien during the sort of Tolkien revival. So again, that kind of really informs the sort of early versions. What we don't think of as much is the way that has had, the way that has changed, and the way that so many other stories have been told as a result. I'm currently playing a game that's based at a university, and all of the characters are students. They're all learning. And I feel like a bit of a glutton for punishment. I'm a university professor who's running a game about being a university student or teaching university students. It's like, how deep does this go? And when I talked earlier about transference, I do try not to make sure that I've characterised any of my students. That would be awfully unprofessional. Yeah, no. But it does seem to me, it's like, why did I pick that particular theme? And I'm actually having a lot of fun with it. I'm finding it very playful. But there's a kind of a Dungeons and Dragons scenario for everything. And again, recently, that's something that has become increasingly highlighted by the various different actual play Twitch shows and series that I'll be going on to talk about later. So again, if we could make this one full screen so that we can see the kind of images on it. We tend to think about a typical person when we think about the Dungeons and Dragons player. We think about that kid or that straggly 20-something in their basement. Elhard should take a photo. We think about that straggly kid in their basement who's playing along with their friends, who wants to be the greatest warrior in the world and has got a great big magic sword that catches fire and all of that kind of thing. And actually that's not really true. First of all, as a UK person, I think it's true that most of us in the UK, basements aren't actually endemic to our architecture. I do have a basement in my house. I think if I were going to run Dungeons and Dragons in it, my players would have a terrible time. It is freezing cold. There is in fact a sort of old-fashioned Victorian pantry down there where you could put your ice and then you could put your food. You know, it's damp, the floors are really unpleasant. You know, it's not that basement. It's not that place of play. And this also counts for the people who are playing at the moment. And these are the statistics from 2020. And you can see that over, I think it's 56%, 57% are under 24, but that also means that they are new players. They are people that have come to Dungeons and Dragons in the last 4 or 5 years, but you can also see the flow there moving up through the age range, and I'm in the old bracket now. I'm in the 13% of people who are still playing. But also, again, there's a real split, and I suspect that this has actually changed slightly over the last 2 years, between male, female, and non-binary, or prefer not to say. There's actually a lot of research at the moment about queer communities and Dungeons and Dragons, and I gave a paper a couple of weeks ago, and it was really interesting to hear people talking about how they'd interviewed lots of people who'd really found role-playing games a really, really exciting place to think about their own representation, because again, it's a game, and to summon the spectre of Johann Huitzinger, you enter a space of play where you can be free, where you can perform things that you might not want to do, and with no cost. You know, it's just a game, and then you can leave it. You can step back out of the magic circle, and and no consequence other than perhaps to the sort of consequences in your mind. So I think this is sort of a very useful way of thinking about the community as one that is evolving, as one that is new, and importantly, as one that isn't coming to Dungeons and Dragons from Dungeons and Dragons. So these aren't players who are going into bookshops and seeing the manual and picking it up and thinking, I'm going to have to run a game. These are people who are watching TV shows or reading a book or seeing a Twitch stream of people playing and are being encouraged to enter this incredibly vibrant and exciting world as a result. And again, I think that changes the landscape, because it means that, again, we've seen 48, nearly 50 years of cultural and demographic change as people move into the hobby. And it is a gigantic hobby. So here's some fab scores here, which I did have a check of these, but forgive me if I'm a little bit off here. So the UK games industry is worth 5.3 billion. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. It's a lot more money than a lot of other things. Again, if you want to take games seriously, there it is. Games Workshop, which is one of the key UK industry people, was recently estimated to be 4 times more than the UK fishing industry, which is also why I used the image of the anglerfish there. I was like, just put some fish in. UK Games Expo, which is the annual board games event down at the Birmingham NEC, had 45,000 people in 2019. Obviously, it was then virtual for the next year. There was a limited in-person event last time, but for those of you who will have attended, you will know that it's gone from some people in a hotel to the biggest halls that the NEC can provide, overspilling into other halls in a matter of years. It has absolutely skyrocketed. And Wizards of the Coast, who are the country who own Dungeons and Dragons, they've recently sort of outstripped the company that owns them. You might have heard of Hasbro. They're a fairly famous board gaming company, and they are probably responsible for most of those games that you see in supermarkets, on supermarket shelves. You know, they sell the sort of big classic titles. Hasbro actually recently had to change its I'm trying to say layout, had to change the way that it was structured so that it's in 3 divisions, and I can't remember the name of the 2 other divisions, but they're called something like, games and events, corporation and marketing, and Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast is so big that it has completely eclipsed this company. And of course, in the New Year's Honours List, we have our very own knight now. We have Sir Ian Livingstone, who was one of the founders of Games Workshop. And here he is with Steve Jackson in Games Workshop in 1978. I think what's really wonderful about this particular photograph is that you can actually see on the shelf, on the top shelf there, they're actually selling Dungeons and Dragons. You can see the AD&D manual there. They're both sort of looking at it as well. So actually, Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson went to Gen Con and brought over copies of Dungeons and Dragons and sold it in their shop. So again, there's this kind of cyclical responsibility there. But yes, I think it's really wonderful that we have a night of games. You know, that's a really sort of serendipitous thing. So again, I sort of talked about this earlier, that we see Dungeons and Dragons now, and we see tabletop role-playing games in really unexpected places, or perhaps they're expected. You know, we expect the basement, we expect the group of people, we expect people at conventions crowded round a table with dice. But perhaps what we don't expect is the use of Dungeons and Dragons as a therapeutic practice. Or again, the fact that skilled running of games has become such a big deal that you can hire people. You can hire people to entertain you who will be able to run an effective game. And for those of you who live near Stafford, you'll know that there's a new geek shop that has opened, and they run Dungeons and Dragons evenings where you can come along and they do exactly that for you. They will run you a game, and again, you can kind of be entertained. Some of these games are official, they're released by the company, but most of them are entirely created by the people who have volunteered or perhaps been paid to do that. And again, quick shout out for how we do that at Staffordshire University. Dungeons and Dragons is taught on 2 of our programs. So we teach it in the first year, where students have to play, document, and arrange a game on the Gameplay Production and Design Narratology course. And we also teach it again in the 3rd year. It's we sort of leveled up. You've leveled up to level 6, as it's known for our 3rd years. Whereas they have to actually have to build a world building document and template for an early section of a campaign. So they have to write a very controlled story, and they have to populate that world, and they have to write a campaign so that somebody else could play it were they given this document. So yeah, there's a complexity there that is very much sort of central to the way that games are understood, and again is kind of recognised as such. So I got asked this in the paper that I gave a couple of weeks ago, because as Dungeons and Dragons has developed over those years, it has significantly changed. And here we've got this sort of lovely cheat sheet of all of the different versions. And in fact, the one on the top left, second, that's the dark one that says Player's Handbook. That was the one that was on the shelf in the previous slide. But what's happened as this game has developed is that the rules have been developed. Because as John Peterson and Sharon Appelkline argue in their histories of Dungeons and Dragons, the early version doesn't give you very many rules. It doesn't really tell you that much what to do. It says things like, it's up to the dungeon master to tell you how this happens, or, you know, the players will decide this by rolling dice. When we're actually teaching games design, board games design to our students, we say, don't say that. You need to say how many sides the dice has. Again, another thing that Dungeons and Dragons is incredibly popularised, and is something that a lot of you will have known if you don't know anything else. You know, it's a game with statistics, it's a game with a lot of dice. But as the versions have gone along, so they have been updated and so they have changed. And they've reached the point where we are now on the 5th edition, 5e, as it's often called, which was implemented in 2014. And, excuse me, and Wizards of the Coast have very strongly implied and in fact started to prepare for a new edition which will potentially be released in 2024. So presumably 6th edition, but we don't know yet. And these add rules, they add situational aspects, they add sort of lists of things, and these vary. And as the games and the manuals develop, so too do the instructions. So too do the things that they tell you to do. It's not just a case of good luck and have fun. The game becomes a world of storytelling and imagination, and those things are often written in the very early sections. And infamously, the 4th edition tried to emulate video games a lot more. It tried to emulate a genre of video games called massively multiplayer online role-playing games, MMOs or MMORPGs, and it was very unsuccessful as a result, because it turned out you can't kind of backwards compatible a game that had already sort of evolved into much more of a creative process. I want to also stress now, because I'm sure there is somebody either in the comments or sort of muttering to themselves, that that's not how they play Dungeons and Dragons, that they play it by rolling dice and moving through dungeons. Perhaps they're using dioramas or maps. And you know what? That's fine. There are as many ways to play Dungeons and Dragons as there are to imagine a character, to imagine that wizard. And actually that's part of one of the things that's really, really wonderful about it. It allows you to play in a very, very sort of automated way, but it also allows you to be very, very creative, to sort of go on sort of wild tangents, to talk to your fellows in character or not. But yeah, I want to kind of stress that that's fine, however you play your game. It's actually Chris Perkins, the CEO of Dungeons and Dragons, recently wrote about that in a statement that I call the No Canon Statement, where he actually says, you know, in your game, X character might be a giant space hamster, and that's fine. That's fine. It doesn't matter, because your game is your own. And so it's really interesting that you have these massive manuals, you have these massive guides to how to play, and yet at the same time, it becomes your own world. And there are 3 central books that you usually kind of have to buy if you're going to run a game. There is the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. And the current edition's 5e, that's 992 pages. That is a lot of reading. And as I've kind of argued, and we'll sort of argue a bit more as I keep talking, I actually think that it makes this game completely unplayable. It's fascinating that it's a game with so many rules, so many situational arguments, and yet it's gigantic. And sure, one of those books is pretty much like a list of monsters, but even so, 992 pages that's a lot to remember, and I don't think you can. Oh, am I going backwards? Yeah, there we go. So I wanted to talk a bit about the Monster Manual, because I've actually written about this elsewhere. I said I wasn't going to name drop too many of my papers, but this one I will. Dungeons and Dragons was actually responsible for reviving a medievalist tradition, which was the idea of the Bestiary, a list of creatures, or sort of creatures that used to be written sort of on the side of illuminated manuscripts that were ghastly and monstrous. And the purpose in Dungeons and Dragons is obviously to use those as creatures that you might encounter in the world. And I was very keen when I put this slide together that I wanted to do 2 things. I wanted my medieval battling slugs. There are many of them, but this is one of my favourites on the top left. But I also wanted to include an absolute classic of Dungeons and Dragons, a creature that's actually copyrighted by Dungeons and Dragons, which is the Beholder. And this is my favourite image of this monster, the Beholder, because look how cheerful it is. It looks so happy. It's going to kind of eat your brains. It's going to come for you. And it's a very deadly monster. But this is a sort of very standard outlay of what a modern bestiary looks like. You've got a list of what it can do. You've got a list of how many hit points it has. You've got a list of the amount of attacks that it does. It has a special magic resistance. That really causes problems because it makes it very deadly. It's an evil character. Dungeons and Dragons, the Wizards of the Coast, have recently actually started to remove alignments because they actually feel that they kind of interfere with roleplay a little bit. You can make your characters evil if you want, but you don't have to, is kind of their new thing. But again, there's a sort of list of its power, you know, what happens if you encounter it. And sure, okay, monster manual. Why is this important? And I was going to talk about, and I will and am talking about why that is so essential to gaming, because the bestiary is where we start to see the sort of influence of this game roll into the rest of gaming. And here we've got some sort of classic examples of bestiaries. So the first one is the Pokédex from Pokemon. Literally a list of creatures with different attributes doing different types of magical attacks that you get to collect. That's the whole game. That's it. Immensely popular game. Really, really wonderful game. And then again, you know, another sort of ghastly beast. It actually looks a little bit like my battling slug, doesn't it? You know, I seem to remember that this is, yes it is, it's a Final Fantasy creature. Different type of genre of game, another genre known as role-playing, but very significantly different, less imaginative choice than perhaps Dungeons and Dragons. But it's not just monsters and magic. This is Train Station 2 that I've been playing quite a lot recently, and it's got a bestiary too. It's got a bestiary of trains that I can collect. And, you know, I can sort of spend a bit of money to get more trains. And the whole point at the end of the game is to have all of the trains, which I'm very fond of trains. So it's definitely the game for me. But again, you know, I think that kind of, it's not just fantasy, it's not just one type of genre, is really kind of apparent in that. And that's also true in the way that this game has kind of permeated popular culture. Now, again, it's great. There's been quite a lot of revisionist history about this recently because there's a bit of a sort of through line that tends to go like this. In 1974, Dungeons and Dragons happened. Then came the 80s and lots of people played role-playing games, and then they started to play them on computers, sort of. And then Dungeons and Dragons went away and everybody started playing video games, and then they started watching television, and then Dungeons and Dragons came back. And that's not actually really what happened. What happened is, sure, it wasn't as popular all the way through and role-playing games weren't as popular, but they didn't disappear. And in fact, they did evolve all the way through. And you can see that influence in, again, texts all over the place. Like this is the original box art from World of Warcraft. And you can see very clearly there is a dwarf. It looks real like that dwarf on the picture that I showed you previously. And there is an elf. And the dwarf is a boy, and he has a Scottish accent in the beginning of the intro sequence. Actually, no, he doesn't talk. I completely made that up. When they talk, they have Scottish accents. And the elves are sort of very fey and slender and thin, and they've got these sort of ridiculous eyebrows. But these conceits are drawn directly from the perception of dwarves and elves, which were Tolkien-esque, that then became part of D&D. So we've got this kind of through line in sort of games that are being generated. And similarly, for those of you who've watched The Witcher, you can break it down really, really easily into recognizable archetypes from role-playing games. So at the front, we've got Henry Cavill, aka Geralt the Witcher, and he's a kind of fighter character. He has 2 swords. He's got a little bit of magic, and it's a magical world, but mainly he just fights things, and he grunts a lot. Up on the top left, you've got Yennefer of Wengerberg, and she is a sorceress, and there's a very specific description of what sorceresses do in the world of The Witcher, in The Witcher games, in The Witcher books, and in The Witcher TV series. They go through a very specific set of training, they level up, and then they become powerful and they cast spells. So she's a magic user, she's your wizard. And then on the right-hand side, we have a typical multi-class character. We've got Ciri. She's got a sort of weird magical effect that she can do. It's kind of innate to her. It's probably something to do with her blood. It's not hugely, haven't got that far in the books yet. But she also learns to be a fighter. And she goes through a series of progresses in the 2 TV series and also in the game and in the books where she becomes stronger. So she gains levels as she becomes more powerful. And we don't usually think of it like that. But again, this is so sort of rolled into the way that we understand fantasy now that it also means that we can pick out these elements when we start to watch these series and think, oh, right, this is how it works. I expect these characters to be much more magically powerful by series 3 or 4 or book 3 or 4 than they are in book 1. I expect them to go through a sort of learning progress. I expect them to get levels. I expect them to have a certain amount of magic, after which their magic is depleted. It doesn't necessarily, there's not a progress bar on The Witcher, but in World of Warcraft you have health and mana, and as you cast those, so they go down. So again, there's this kind of embedding of the statistical properties of D&D and other tabletop role-playing games into popular culture. And I think, again, as I've sort of said, we have this development of role-playing games throughout the last 40, 50 years, where people also think, you know what, I don't really want to do fantasy, I'd like to do something else. Or, I really like the idea of playing chivalric knights. So in the summer, we're going to go adventuring, and in the winter, we're going to stay at home and do romance and politics. Or, I really like watching Stranger Things. What if there was a game where I could be those kids? What if I could be those kids on a bike? Or, the thing that I really like about tabletop role-playing games is making the world. I really like the bit where you actually build it. So let's have a couple of games about that they're literally about building the games, and you don't need anything particularly complicated. What you do need is a deck of cards, because this is a real imaginative type of game. And so you can see that sort of happening again with these characteristic games that I have listed here. There are dozens and dozens and hundreds of different types of role-playing games. There's something for everybody. Some of them are very, very serious. Some of them are not serious at all. Some of them are things in between. So these games are developing in parallel with the rest of popular culture. There's not this kind of vacuum where they sort of suddenly stop and everybody walks off and picks up, Mario. They're actually all, everything kind of interreacts and develops at the same time to that 992 pages. So I'm going to kind of finish up the last sort of big section by talking about some of the recent changes and why they're so important to the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons. And the first thing is, this is one of my characters from, God, look at her, isn't she magnificent? All those numbers. This is one of my characters from one of my current campaigns. And I think, again, this is often what people think about. They think about a lot of numbers that don't mean very much. They're real complicated. There's a lot of pluses and minuses there. There's a lot of words that are very, there's a lot of kind of specific gaming words. And that's going to be really, really hard to play. And 5th edition, despite the fact this is a 5th edition character sheet, is actually intended to make things a lot more, not necessarily freeform, but easy to understand. And they kind of go with this kind of ethos all the way through. So they basically say, as with the no canon statement, which is a bit more recent, that, rule of cool, right? If you do something really cool, think about how you might integrate that into the game. They consider the idea that Dungeons & Dragons is a very luck-based game. It's about rolling dice, and you roll low, you didn't do very well. You roll high, you're very excited, you did well, you make up what happened as a result of that. They encourage the idea that every game is unique. And a lot of the rules that now exist, again in those 3 manuals, as I said, are situational. So there's rules for falling in lava, because, hey, somebody's always going to fall in the lava, right? But when does that really come up? They're there if you need them, But if you forget, it doesn't really matter. Maybe you just hurt your foot a little bit. And they also acknowledge the fact that it's very hard to remember everything. You can't, the flow of the game is encouraged as being important rather than a sort of stop-start. But that does happen. Also, it's fine. Ask for clarifications. Be nice. Players be kind to their dungeon masters. Dungeon masters be kind to their players. And so they encourage this idea of multiple ways to play. And alongside this comes Twitch. And alongside this comes what are known as actual plays. Now, actual plays begin on both podcasts. Hi, Octothorpe. I know that you're not an actual play. I just thought I'd, say Octothorpe. But they come along as podcasts and they come along as Twitch streams. And what they are is basically people playing games in set groups. So the groups don't change very much from week to week. And they're playing one long campaign to a televised audience. That audience are live in as much as they're watching on Twitch, rather like I'm talking to you now and there's only 2 people in this studio. But they are kind of performative. And this group you can see here, this is the Critical Role group. They are probably the most well-known of the actual play groups. There they all are on the left there. Their game master is a gentleman called Matthew Mercer. That's him in the middle. There's a lady with a stripy top who's got her hand on him. She's actually his wife, and also plays one of my favourite characters of all time because they're very good at playing their characters. But this is what he says in the 51st second of the first episode. So he says, but do note, for all you hardcore gamers out there, a lot of this is house ruled, kind of loosey-goosey. So, having a good time. So all you number crunchers out there, paying attention just stop, have fun with it. And so he actually says that the rules of the game at the beginning don't not matter, but it's okay if they don't get them right. And the sort of ethos of these players, who are very obviously sort of very good friends with each other, they're all also voice actors, so they're very good at remaining in character, they're very good at doing voices, they're very good at being performative, but they're also very good at asking questions. They're also very good at saying, how do I do this? I'm not sure whether I've got this right or not. Let's just have a quick stop, check the rule, and again, Matt Mercer is very, very good at remembering those 992 pages, but if he can't remember, for example, the lava rule, then he will make something up plausible, and so the game flows as a result of that. And you can see on the right-hand side there some of their characters from the second campaign. And this series in particular, along with another series called The Adventure Zone, which is a podcast, become incredibly popular because they're incredibly listenable. As I say, they're very kind of performative. They're very much at the high end of role-playing. But they're also really kind of relaxing to watch. I was actually talking to a friend of mine about this at the weekend, and we were saying one of the things about it is that there's kind of this flow to the game where you feel drawn in by the story, but the episodes are quite long. They can be 3 hours to 5 hours long or 3.5 hours long. So you're not glued to the screen. This kind of story is flowing over you, and sometimes you really will concentrate. But actually the camaraderie, the sort of low level of performance is actually a really kind of pleasant experience. And I actually started watching Critical Role during the pandemic, and I have almost got up to date. There are over 300 episodes. As I say, they are very, very long, but I just found it incredibly soothing. And yes, there's moments of high tension, there's moments of drama, there's some real amazing gotchas where you're really sort of blown away by the creativity of the cast. But they're just a nice thing to be watching, and they feel friendly, and that sort of escapism is very sort of reassuring. Critical Role's become an absolutely massive thing, a massive, massive phenomenon. And again has been embedded in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. So these are actually official Dungeons and Dragons supplements. The Call of the Netherdeep hasn't quite been released yet. Explorer's Guide to Wildmount was out, I think, last year. Excuse me. But you know, the world itself, the world that is built, has such a sort of potential for imagination that there has been a sort of series of collaborations as a result of that. And again, that shows a sort of very canny attitude by Wizards of the Coast, that they're very happy to sort of bring in popularity, that they're not precious about this. They actually have a number of different clauses within the sort of people who wish to write supplements that allow you to create unofficial supplements or publish them throughout one of their publishing arms. And you can go away and have a look at the OGL and the systems documents about that if you really want. But the main thing about this is that it allows both formal versions like this, but also for people to write their own campaigns. And I think it's also worth stating that the majority of Dungeons and Dragons games are never written down. They're entirely in the minds of the people who are playing them, and those people sitting at their tables or online or wherever it is that they're playing. And as a result of that, again, it feels, the game itself kind of, as I say, it sort of has this sort of seepage into the rest of everything else. Maybe it's something that you only did a couple of times when you were a kid. Maybe you've never played, but you've probably heard of it. You've probably, even if it is that dice preconception and those numbers, that it will be something that you're kind of aware of. But I think the really fascinating thing that we're actually seeing now is, again, Dungeons and Dragons rolling out into the rest of the community, that we're seeing incredibly thematic aspects. And this is, first of all, it's the final slide, you can all relax. But secondly, apart from the thank you slide, but secondly, this is the Legend of Vox Machina, which is a anime dramatization or cartoon dramatization of Critical Role's first series, with all the original cast who are already voice actors playing their own characters and also being voice actors at the same time. So there's this real kind of feeling of kind of not only full circle, because this was released on Amazon Prime on the 28th of January, so it's, you know, it's only been out a month, but there's this real feeling of kind of centralization, you know, that this is a popular thing that has entered a mainstream world, you know, the world of Amazon. So, thank you very much. If you've got any questions, now is your moment. So yeah, thank you. I hope that entertained and delighted you. And I hope you're all going to go off and actually don't ask questions. Go and play games.
Hi Esther, thank you very much. This was amazing, and it generated a really good discussion on our YouTube chat. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who tuned in. We have people dialing in from various locations across the UK, Ireland, Scotland, United States, and India, which is absolutely amazing. I have some questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
You touched on the critical role. So the question is, thinking about Dungeons and Dragons in the public eye, for example, Critical Role, and the conversation regarding Orientalism and Series 3, is there a different level of responsibility when creating for an audience versus a home game?
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to contextualize this question a little bit as well. So as you saw from the image that I showed, let's go back to it. The cast present as white. And the third season, which is the series runs in campaigns, is set in an area of the world that's been developed that's called Marquette, which has been specifically coded as an area that has potentially more people of colour, and it has more, I think unorthodox is the best way to describe it, what's known as races in the game. So you have people who are an elephant type of people, and there are bird people. And the cast within that are navigating their own play, and they have in fact included another player who is a player of colour with this environment. And there's been a lot of discussion about this, about whether or not they're doing it in a positive way or a negative way. I think they've made a slight error by including a credit sequence that presents them as 1920s-ish explorers. So it sort of presents them in, it does present them as a kind of colonizing group of people. And I think that's something that they really should have been a bit more aware of than they did. They've also in the past played both queer characters when they represent, as far as we know, because really isn't any of our business, but usually represent themselves as straight, and also people of colour when they are not. And I think, yes, there is a responsibility. Like when you are, and actually, I don't think it's a difference between playing online and playing offline. I think you have a responsibility to present yourself in a sensitive manner, no matter what your context is. Like this isn't let's all go off into the corner and you know, I don't know, be racist. When you are playing your character, you need to think about that all the way through. And yeah, like that's actually a very serious thing to be thinking about. And I do think, yeah, the third season, there are some missteps, which I hope they will be remedied. Yeah. Like.
Thank you. Question from Alison. What's most exciting you right now about Dungeons and Dragons in particular? And now, forgive me, I'm not a gamer, but I'll try my best. And TTRPGs in general.
Okay, yeah, so tabletop role-playing games is TTRPG. Thanks, Alison. What's exciting me the most? Well, first of all, I'm playing again, and I haven't been playing for years. So I'm kind of literally excited for it being Sunday afternoon and being able to play. Actually, what I'm really excited about is being a dungeon master, because I've never done that before. Like I have never DM'd before, and I am dungeon mastering at the moment, and I'm absolutely loving it. But I think actually the other thing that I'm really enjoying is basically one of the things that a lot of the new expansions and manuals and whatnot have done is that they've integrated racial diversity and queerness into them as a default. So in the 2014 Player's Handbook, there's actually a sort of statement about, you know, this is how you might want to represent yourself. And it feels very much like guidelines. And I think in the context of 2014, that was a really good thing to do. And interestingly, they actually changed the language in that slightly, because when I was researching the other paper that I did, I actually found a different version that had removed some language. And I think, again, that was a very good, sensible thing to do. But I think actually just seeing different people in the manuals and sort of reading about them, and again, it's not a kind of oh my goodness, there's a gay person, or you know, there's a person of colour, that they are just integrated into the world and there is no business about that. That's actually, I find that really exciting because it just feels welcoming. Yeah. Particularly when I speak to my students, and I know that there are a very large amount of queer players who are really sort of enjoying that as well. So I can kind of see it in my students. So yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. We've got a question from Mohammed. Prince of Persia was the first game I really enjoyed with smooth graphics. If I was wanting to pursue this via Dungeons and Dragons, which would be the closest character?
Oh my gosh, wow. I mean, I think in terms of being a character, because you can make your own character, then that's kind of your choice, Mohammed. I think if you were going to go for a class, because you choose different attributes, I think you might want to go for the monk class, because they can do lots of kind of acrobatics and jumping around and kind of flipping, so you get that kind of, you can do that sort of Prince of Persia kind of movement. They've also got a movement called Step of the Wind, which allows them to move really quickly. Or you could just go for a sort of straightforward fighter. In terms of the actual games, the worlds are sort of infinite. There's been a sort of lot of rewriting of the world recently. So, for example, there's a dungeon master and a player who I really respect called B. Dave Walters, who did a lot of consultation on sort of making sure that some of the Oriental aspects, so Chult, for example, which is one of the countries that was previously coded quite problematically, have been kind of made more dynamic and exciting. But again, having said that, you know, the world is so broad that I think it's more of a case of playing the character than finding a place. Because again, I think that puts you in a rather sort of, I want to be a certain person doing a certain thing, and that's actually not quite what the world allows you to do, because it allows you to be anyone. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So, as a non-gamer, I shall attempt again of trying to make sense of this question. I'm really sorry, dear audience. So, originally and for a while, RPGs aligned themselves with different subgenres. Has that changed much in the last few years? So, superheroes versus medieval fantasy.
Ooh, it depends. You can play some very, very thematic games. And obviously, sort of Dungeons and Dragons tends to stick to high fantasy. But I think you can kind of go looking for things. So one of the actual plays that I've watched quite a lot of is a series called Dimension 20. And one of the things that they do is they sort of do 5-6 episode series where they sort of choose a subgenre. So they did one set at a school. This is before the recent Strixhaven supplement came out. They've done one where everybody is playing very, very sort of tiny people like insects in a sort of child's backyard. So that's, I don't even know what kind of genre that is. And they've also done things. They're doing a science fiction based one at the moment. So I think again, it's a yes and no. There are definitely things out there that you can go and find. I mean, there's things also, there's sort of very famous games like Vampire the Masquerade or Call of Cthulhu, which again kind of align themselves with horror or perhaps vampires, you know, vampires and politics. So kind of a sort of yes and no, I think. I think the genre's become, the genre of tabletop role-playing games has become more flexible, but that's like the sort of nerd culture thing, that means it's allowed more things in. So it's allowed more sort of thematic areas or subgenres into the area. So yeah, interesting.
Thank you. So we've got 3 more questions. Can you say something about the interaction between Dungeons and Dragons, hypertextual ergodic narratives, fighting fantasy and their predecessors, and interactive fiction?
Who asked that? Come on.
I have no idea. Was that the wrong question?
Yeah, no. It totally is. It totally is. I mean, they're 3 different things because obviously, sort of hypertext narratives, fighting fantasy, and sort of D&D. They're also kind of themed for different groups. So, for example, I think if you're looking at the sort of literature side, you're often looking at a younger age group. A lot of the fighting fantasy and books like the Sonic the Hedgehog Choose Your Own Adventure series were obviously written for younger readers. So they were written for they were sort of written as a literacy thing as well as a kind of a way of bringing people in. Hypertext. I think hypertext is interesting because it is seen as one of the sort of the stepping stones of Dungeons and Dragons. So there was, you know, first there was Dungeons and Dragons, then there was MMO, and then there was MUD, and sort of hypertext, and then things sort of moved on. So I think in terms of historicising, those are probably the ones that have remained behind, because even sort of the Choose Your Own Adventure stuff is still continuing. I think there was a recent Choose Your Own Adventure within the last sort of 3 or 4 years, and I obviously know at least one group of people who are collaboratively playing a Sonic the Hedgehog read-through at the moment. So yeah, interesting. Thanks for the theory there.
Thank you for this answer, Esther. So D&D 5e simplified the rules a lot, but pigeonholed a lot of char creation. Do you think we might see a return to the 3.5 style of plus 32 stealth as level 6 gnome rogue, or will 6 stay simple?
I feel like you're kind of you're being tortured with these questions. So this is a question about the different editions of Dungeons and Dragons, and 3.5 was very popular. It was actually, I think, the second version I played. I definitely played a bit of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then there was a bit of a leapfrog because 4th edition wasn't very popular to 5th edition, which simplified a lot of the rules. So again, there's a lot of speculation about what's going to happen next. My feeling is there's going to be more of the same. And in terms of being simple, being very much a sort of, choose your own destiny, tools for imagination. And the reason I think that is because of things like Critical Role here, because they really have reformed the way, they're so popular. I didn't actually come up with the stats for it. It's very difficult to find kind of combined stats and YouTube stuff. But I can kind of faithfully say about the same amount of people that watch Bake Off watch Critical Role. So, when you sort of think of the popularity of Great British Bake Off and its universality, it's syndicated to goodness knows how many different countries, then I think you can actually sort of see just how influential Critical Role and its ilk have been. Because hey, people are baking all the time because of watching a BBC series, but they're playing all the time because of watching this particular series. Again, I had a student say to me the other day that he was been really influenced by, there is a character who's playing a bard at the moment, again another type of class, on the most recent series, and he said, I didn't know that you could play a bard as just being someone who said, yeah, go on, have some points, is one of the things a bard does, because the first bard in the first series sings and performs every single spell he casts. So that student had clearly taken the understanding of what a bard was entirely from Critical Role, and they had no other context for it. Whereas I would never have. The effort that goes into this character, literally singing popular tunes in Dungeons and Dragons language is it's too complicated for me to even pass. I tried singing in my game at the weekend, and yeah, it's kind of awkward. I love DMing, but that was awkward.
Thank you, Esther. Last question, I'm afraid. We still have some questions in our chat, so if we take them away, and then if you can reply, and when we send follow-up information to our attendees with a YouTube link again to watch afterwards and share with others, we can include the answers to those questions.
Yeah, sorry folks, there is a train after this, so I'm not in my house. We're not on Zoom anymore.
The last question is, I was away and I started playing again with my 7-year-olds. One thing that struck me as very different was tools for safety, lines and veils or X-card. What do you think about these tools?
Yeah, I was actually talking to my students about this in a class only 2 or 3 hours ago. I think that having what's called a session 0 and also discussing blinds and veils, which is things that you will not do and things that you're prepared to kind of look at but you don't want to get too close to, you can look through them through a veil, or having a session before you start to play where you discuss your expectations. I think they are an incredibly good idea, and incredibly important as well, because for example, one of my hard no's in any campaign that I play is that I'm quite happy for there to be violence. It is often, you kill things, you kill monsters, that's part of the game. I do not want any discussions of the breaking of limbs, because I very, very badly broke my leg several years ago, and I can still, I don't want that in my game. I don't want to relive the sort of horrendous pain that happened to me. But there's other things as well, for example, you can use your early session to talk about the type of game you want to play. Do you want to play a really imaginative one? Do you want to play one where you constantly stay in character? Or is that really difficult for you? Are you somebody who's going to need breaks? So are you happy to play for 3 hours, or do you need to play for 3/4 of an hour and then have a break and a stretch? Like, these things are actually good, they're good manners, they're good social behavior. And it doesn't have to be a kind of, oh my God, I can't possibly talk about the horrible trauma of this. It needs to be a sensible conversation about things that you do not want in your world. And I think that's absolutely fine. Again, you are going to collaboratively create a world. And the idea is to have fun, not to come out feeling as if you're, great. Like, emotion can be really important. And there are some games that are about very serious events and they're about very traumatic things. But if you go into those without telling your players you're going to do that, then that's a no. Yeah, I absolutely think they're a great idea. And even with your 7-year-old, it's like I'm sure you're not going to be submitting your 7-year-old to sort of absolutely grim, dark, horrible trauma. And you'll probably know there are some things they don't like. But yeah, like, do you want to go and have a pee? Sure, you know, this again, that's the sort of level of what these discussions should also be about, because yeah, we want to have fun, you know, we want to enjoy ourselves.
Thank you, Esther. I do hope that you're going to have a look at the chat
I
later
will,
on.
yeah.
Because
train first, then I'll have a look.
It generated great discussion, and a lot of people said what a great lecture this was.
Thanks.
And
Thanks everyone.
I'm
Thank
sure
you.
if we were actually all together in one room, you would have a standing ovation. So thank you very much. It was amazing. We hope to do more lectures with you in the future. If anyone else is interested in all the events that the university is delivering, you can go on our website, staffs.ac.uk/events, where we've got all our events streamed, recorded, and you can watch that. Thank you very much. Have a good evening or good day if you're somewhere across the globe, and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for coming. And Glasgow in 2024 will also make sure that we circulate this as soon as it goes up. So again, we'll make sure that all the university sites are sent out. But yeah, thank you. Thanks.